The chapel was silent except for the soft hum of murmured prayers and the faint rustle of flowers adorning the pews. Helena's hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet, the lace of her wedding dress brushing against the floor as she peeked through the heavy oak doors. Her heart pounded as the minutes ticked by, the altar still empty. "Where is he?" someone whispered behind her, their hushed voice laced with unease. Helena's chest tightened, her eyes fixed on the doorway at the far end of the chapel. Any moment now, she told herself. Any moment, Enzo would walk in with that confident smile that had swept her off her feet. But the minutes stretched into an eternity, and with every passing second, the cold, creeping realization began to settle in her stomach. Enzo wasn't coming. And just like that, her perfect world began to shatter. Helena stood in front of the mirror in the small dressing room of the chapel, her hands trembling as she adjusted the delicate lace of her veil. The room was filled with the soft scent of roses, her favorite flower, woven into every detail of her wedding day. The bouquet on the table was a masterpiece she had created herself. Ivory roses, pale pink peonies, and sprigs of lavender. Everything was perfect, just as she had envisioned since the day Enzo had proposed. Her best friend, Clara, helped fasten the last button on Helena's gown, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You look breathtaking," Clara said, stepping back to admire her. "Enzo won't be able to take his eyes off you." Helena smiled, but her stomach fluttered with nervous energy. She tried to shake off the unease creeping into her thoughts. Enzo had been distant over the past few weeks, consumed by work and the pressures of his booming cosmetics empire. He'd promised her it was just a temporary storm they needed to weather. "Once the wedding is over, everything will settle," he had said. As the minutes ticked by, Helena could hear the murmur of the guests gathering in the chapel. Her heart swelled with a mixture of love and anticipation. She envisioned Enzo standing at the altar, his dark eyes filled with the same tenderness he had shown her on the night they first met. She reminded herself that he loved her, despite the doubts clawing at the edges of her mind. The music began to play, signaling it was time. Clara squeezed her hand and kissed her cheek. "This is your moment," she whispered. Helena took a deep breath and stepped out of the dressing room, her father waiting to escort her down the aisle. The chapel was filled with the soft glow of candles, the air heavy with the fragrance of lilies and orchids that adorned the pews. Guests turned to watch as Helena made her way down the aisle, their faces lit with admiration. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for Enzo. But as she reached the front, the altar stood empty. A wave of confusion rippled through her. She turned to the priest, who looked back at her with sympathy. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, the atmosphere shifting from admiration to unease. Helena's chest tightened as she looked at Clara, who was seated in the front row, her expression filled with alarm. The priest stepped closer, his voice low but kind. "It seems there's been a delay. Let's give him a few more minutes." Helena nodded numbly, her bouquet trembling in her hands. She stared at the door at the far end of the chapel, willing it to open. Every second felt like an eternity. The guests began whispering to each other, their faces a mix of curiosity and pity. Clara approached her cautiously, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Maybe he's stuck in traffic. You know how punctual he is," she said, her tone attempting optimism but failing to mask her own growing concern. Helena forced a smile, trying to hold herself together. Enzo wouldn't do this to her. He wouldn't abandon her, not after everything they had shared, the promises they had made. Minutes turned into a quarter of an hour, then half an hour. The whispers among the guests grew louder. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged knowing glances. Clara tried calling Enzo, but her attempts went unanswered. Panic began to creep into Helena's chest like a cold fog. The priest approached again, his expression more somber this time. "I'm sorry, Miss Helena. We haven't heard from Mr. Enzo. Would you like to proceed with the ceremony, or?" His words struck her like a thunderclap. She felt her knees weaken, and Clara caught her arm to steady her. Her father stepped forward, his face tight with a mix of anger and worry. "This is unacceptable," he muttered under his breath. glaring toward the chapel doors as if willing Enzo to appear. Tears stung Helena's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She straightened her back, her voice trembling but firm. "I think we need to end this," she said, her words slicing through the murmurs in the room. The guests began to stand, their movements hesitant as they shuffled toward the exit. Some offered Helena sympathetic smiles. Others avoided her gaze entirely. Clara stayed by her side, her presence the only thing keeping Helena from collapsing under the weight of humiliation. As the last of the guests filed out, Helena stood alone at the altar. The silence of the empty chapel was deafening. The flickering candles and the soft rustle of her gown were the only sounds that remained. Her fingers loosened around the bouquet, and it fell to the floor, the petals scattering like broken dreams. Clara wrapped an arm around her, whispering words of comfort Helena couldn't quite hear. The shock numbed her senses, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Why would Enzo do this? What had gone so wrong? Outside the chapel, a storm had begun to brew. The wind howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the stained glass windows. It was as if the heavens were echoing the storm raging within Helena's heart. She allowed Clara to guide her back to the dressing room, where she collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands. The sound of Clara's phone buzzing pulled them both from the silence. Clara glanced at the screen, her jaw tightening. "It's Enzo's assistant," she said, her voice clipped. She answered the call, her tone icy. "Where is he?" Helena watched as Clara's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. When Clara ended the call, her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He's gone, Helena. He left the city. No explanation, no message." Helena felt the words hit her like a physical blow. The weight of them sank into her chest, crushing her. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The man she had trusted with her heart, her future, had walked away without a word. She stood abruptly, her movements sharp and filled with suppressed rage. "Take this off," she said, her voice a raw whisper as she tugged at the lace of her veil. Clara helped her out of the gown, her hands trembling as much as Helena's. The rain outside continued to pound, a relentless reminder of the chaos and sorrow that had consumed the day. Helena stared at her reflection in the mirror, her makeup smudged and her eyes hollow. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable. As the storm raged on, Helena made a silent vow to herself. She would not let this destroy her. She had spent her life nurturing beauty, bringing life to the world through her flowers. Somehow, she would find a way to pick up the shattered pieces of her heart and bloom again. Helena sat on the edge of her bed in the tiny apartment she had rented in a town far from the city she once called home. The small room smelled of freshly painted walls and damp cardboard boxes that held the remnants of her previous life. She stared at her hands, which rested on the slight curve of her belly, her thoughts a mix of fear and determination. It had been 3 months since that disastrous day at the chapel, and life had become a blur of emotions she could barely name. First, there was humiliation, facing the whispers and pitying glances from people who had attended the wedding. Then came anger, hot and consuming, directed at Enzo and herself for ever believing in him. Finally, there was despair, the kind that hit her in the quiet moments, making her wonder how she could ever move forward. The realization that she was pregnant had come as both a shock and a lifeline. At first, the idea of carrying Enzo's children filled her with dread. The man who had abandoned her at the altar had left her with more than heartache. He had left her with a future she hadn't planned for. But as days turned into weeks, she began to feel a strange sense of peace. She wasn't alone. The fluttering life within her became a beacon, a reason to keep going when everything else felt hopeless. The small town where she had relocated was nothing like the bustling city she'd left behind. Its streets were lined with cozy shops and family-run cafes, a stark contrast to the sleek glass towers and fast-paced energy of her old life. Helena chose it precisely for this reason. She needed somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knew her name or her story. Her apartment was modest but functional, with a tiny kitchen, that barely fit a table for two. The window overlooked a courtyard where children often played, their laughter echoing in the afternoons. Helena had spent the last of her savings on the deposit and the essentials, but the funds were running low. She knew she would need to find work soon. The first few weeks in the town were lonely. Helena avoided the locals, unsure of how to interact without revealing too much of her past. She spent her days unpacking, organizing, and planning. At night, she would sit by the window with a notebook, sketching ideas for a new life she wasn't sure she could afford. One morning, while walking to the market, Helena noticed a small patch of land at the edge of the town square. It was overgrown with weeds, the remains of what might have once been a garden struggling to peek through the tangled mess. Something about it caught her attention. She stood there for a while, imagining the flowers it could hold, the life it could bring to the center of the town. On her way back, she stopped by the local library and asked the librarian, an older woman with kind eyes, about the plot of land. "Oh, that used to be a community garden," the librarian explained, "but it's been abandoned for years. No one's taken care of it since old Mr. Thompson moved away." Helena felt a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in months. She asked if there was any way to get permission to use it, and the librarian gave her the contact information for the town council. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and paperwork. Helena presented her case to the council, explaining how she wanted to restore the garden, to turn it into something beautiful again. They were hesitant at first, questioning her motives and her ability to manage such a project on her own. But when Helena spoke about her years of experience as a florist and her love for nurturing plants, they relented. She was given a small budget and permission to start work. With a purpose in mind, Helena threw herself into the project. She spent hours clearing the weeds, her hands blistered and sore from the effort. The physical work was exhausting but therapeutic. Each day, she felt a little lighter, a little stronger. Some of the townspeople began to take notice of her efforts. An elderly man named Jack offered to lend her tools, and a young mother named Maria brought her sandwiches and lemonade during the long afternoons. Helena was hesitant to let people in at first, but their kindness began to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. One evening, after a particularly long day, Maria sat with Helena on the edge of the garden, watching the sunset. "You're really making a difference here," Maria said, her voice soft. "This place was just a forgotten patch of dirt before you came along." Helena smiled, though her heart felt heavy. "It's not just about the garden," she admitted. "It's about finding something worth holding on to again." Maria didn't press her for more, sensing there was a story Helena wasn't ready to share. Instead, she squeezed Helena's hand and said, "You're doing a beautiful job." As the months passed, the garden began to bloom. Helena planted sunflowers, daisies, and marigolds, their vibrant colors transforming the once-forgotten space. People started visiting, bringing their children to play among the flowers. The garden became a place of community and connection, and for the first time in a long while, Helena felt a sense of belonging. Her belly grew, and with it, so did her determination. The work was harder as her pregnancy progressed, but she refused to slow down. The garden was her anchor, a symbol of the new life she was building for herself and her children. In her quieter moments, she thought about Enzo. She wondered if he knew about the pregnancy, if he cared, but she pushed those thoughts away. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. On a warm spring morning, Helena stood in the middle of the garden, her hands resting on her belly as she looked around at the life she had cultivated. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their petals catching the sunlight. She felt a kick beneath her hand, a reminder of the 3 lives growing inside her. This was her life now, simple and imperfect, but hers. She had found a way to start again, to put down new roots. And though the scars of her past still lingered, she knew she was stronger for it. As the town embraced her in her garden, Helena began to feel something she hadn't in a long time: hope. And as she watched a group of children run through the garden, their laughter filling the air, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, She could find happiness again. The sun was setting over the sprawling fields of exotic flowers that had been the pride of Enzo's cosmetics empire for years. Acres of vibrant bloom stretched as far as the eye could see, their fragrances mingling in the warm evening air. But tonight, the usual tranquility of the scene was marred by unease. Enzo stood at the edge of the main greenhouse, staring at a patch of withering flowers in the distance. Their leaves had turned brittle, their once vivid petals faded to dull, lifeless shades. He clenched his fists, the weight of the problem pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Have you confirmed the reports?" he asked Marco, his operations manager, who stood beside him holding a clipboard filled with data. Marco nodded grimly. "It's worse than we thought. The blight is spreading faster than anticipated. It's affecting nearly 30% of our fields already, and the greenhouse plants are starting to show signs too." Enzo exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. The blight was an agricultural nightmare, an insidious disease that crept through the roots and stems of plants, leaving devastation in its wake. For a company that relied on rare and exotic flowers to create its high-end cosmetics, this was nothing short of a disaster. "What about the containment measures? The chemical treatments?" Enzo asked, his voice edged with desperation. "We've tried everything recommended by the experts," Marco said. "Nothing's working. And if this continues," he hesitated, unwilling to finish the thought. Enzo knew what he was trying to say. If the blight wasn't stopped, the company would lose its entire supply chain. Without those flowers, they couldn't produce their signature products, the luxurious creams and perfumes that had catapulted Enzo to success. Investors were already restless, and competitors would pounce at the first sign of weakness. "We need another solution," Enzo said firmly, his mind racing. "Contact every agricultural expert, every scientist. I don't care how much it costs. Just find someone who can fix this." Marco nodded and walked away, leaving Enzo alone with his thoughts. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. His empire, built on innovation and ambition, now teetered on the edge of collapse because of something as unpredictable as nature. That night, Enzo sat in his office, poring over reports and research papers. The sleek, modern desk was cluttered with documents, coffee cups, and a laptop with a dozen tabs open. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from board members and investors, but he ignored them. Hours passed, and fatigue began to set in. Just as he was about to give up for the night, a line in one of the reports caught his eye. It was buried in a long list of recommendations. Natural pest control and soil revitalization methods are being successfully implemented in smaller-scale operations. Enzo frowned, rereading the sentence. It wasn't a solution, but it was a lead. He typed a quick search into his laptop, scanning through articles and case studies. Most of the information was vague, theoretical, or irrelevant. But then he found a mention of a specific region where these methods had been tested with success. His breath caught when he read the name of the town. It was the same quiet town where Helena had disappeared to after he left her. The memory of her hit him like a cold wave. He hadn't thought about Helena in months, or rather, he had tried not to think about her. The guilt of what he had done was too heavy, and the fear of facing her again too paralyzing. But now, with his company's future hanging in the balance, he couldn't ignore the possibility that the solution might lie in the hands of the woman he had once abandoned. The next morning, Enzo called Marco into his office. "I need you to prepare for an extended trip," Enzo said, his tone brisk. "We're heading to a town a few hours from here. There's someone there who might be able to help." Marco raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Someone who knows how to work with flowers," Enzo replied, avoiding the question. "And who has experience with natural cultivation methods." Marco hesitated but didn't press further. He left to make the arrangements, leaving Enzo to wrestle with his thoughts. The drive to the town was uneventful, but Enzo's nerves were frayed by the time they arrived. The car wound through narrow streets lined with quaint houses and shops, a stark contrast to the bustling city he was used to. As they approached the town square, Enzo noticed a small garden brimming with colorful flowers. He slowed the car, his eyes drawn to a woman crouched by a bed of marigolds. She wore a simple sundress, her hair tied back in a loose braid, and her hands were covered in soil. Even from a distance, Enzo recognized her, Helena. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. She looked different, not just older but stronger, more grounded. Yet there was still an air of softness about her, a quiet beauty that hadn't faded. Helena stood and wiped her hands on a cloth, unaware of his presence. She turned to speak to a group of children playing nearby, her smile warm and genuine. The sight sent a pang of guilt through Enzo. This was a woman he had left behind, the woman whose life he had upended with his cowardice. He parked the car and stepped out, his movements hesitant. Marco stayed behind, sensing that this was a moment Enzo needed to face alone. As Enzo approached, Helena finally noticed him. Her expression shifted from confusion to shock, then quickly to something harder to read. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice guarded. Enzo took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I need your help," he said simply. Helena's eyes narrowed. "My help? After everything? I know I have no right to ask," Enzo admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But there's a blight destroying the flowers we use for the company. I've tried every expert, every method, and nothing's worked. I heard about what you've done here, and I thought," he trailed off, his words faltering under her piercing gaze. Helena crossed her arms, her posture tense. "You thought you could just walk back into my life and ask for favors." "It's not like that," Enzo said quickly. "I'm not here to make excuses for what I did. I don't know who else to turn to." Helena stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold. "I don't owe you anything, Enzo." "I know," he said softly. "But this isn't just about me. If the flowers die, the farmers who grow them lose their livelihoods. Hundreds of people will be affected. Please, Helena, if you can help, I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Her gaze flickered, the hardness in her eyes softening just slightly. She looked away, her thoughts clearly racing. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed. "I'll think about it," she said, her tone still wary. "But don't expect anything from me. You've already taken more than I was willing to give." Enzo nodded, knowing he couldn't push her further. He turned to leave, but as he walked away, he glanced back and saw Helena looking at the garden, her expression a mix of pain and determination. He realized then that this wouldn't just be a battle to save the flowers. It would be a battle to earn back the trust of the woman he had once betrayed, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength to win. Helena couldn't sleep that night. After her unexpected encounter with Enzo, her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. She sat by the window, staring out at the garden she had nurtured into bloom, its flowers bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. The serenity of the scene was a stark contrast to the turmoil in her chest. His face haunted her. He looked different, tired, older, burdened by something she couldn't quite place. But beneath the weariness, he was still the man who had once made her believe in a future filled with love and laughter. The same man who had crushed her world with a single act of cowardice. Helena clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. How dare he come back now, after all these years, asking for her help? Did he truly believe she would just forget the pain he had caused? The next morning, Helena was in the garden early, seeking solace in the familiar rhythm of tending to her plants. She crouched by the lavender bed, carefully pruning the stems, the scent of the flowers calming her frayed nerves. "Morning, Helena," a cheerful voice called out. She looked up to see Maria, her friend and neighbor, walking toward her with a basket of fresh eggs. Maria's usual bright smile dimmed as she drew closer, her keen eyes noticing Helena's tense expression. "You okay?" Maria asked, crouching beside her. Helena hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I had an unexpected visitor yesterday," she said finally, keeping her voice neutral. Maria tilted her head curiously. Someone important? Helena let out a bitter laugh. Once, a long time ago. Maria didn't press for details, sensing the weight of the topic. Instead, she placed a comforting hand on Helena's shoulder. If you need to talk, I'm here. Helena nodded, grateful for the support, but she wasn't ready to unpack the memories Enzo's return had dredged up. Not yet. Later that afternoon, as she sorted through her gardening tools in the small shed, she heard footsteps approaching. Her heart sank. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Helena! Enzo's voice came softly from behind her. She straightened her back, but didn't turn to face him. I told you I'd think about it, she said curtly. I know, he replied, his tone cautious. But I wanted to explain. You deserve to hear it. Helena finally turned, her eyes sharp as they met his. What could you possibly say that would make any of it better? You left me, Enzo, at the altar. Do you have any idea what that did to me? He flinched at the raw pain in her voice, but he didn't look away. I know I hurt you, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I was a coward. I let my fear and the pressure get the better of me. He paused, struggling to find the words. I thought I was doing the right thing by walking away. I thought you deserved someone better than me. Someone who wouldn't drag you into my world of constant demands and expectations. Helena laughed bitterly, shaking her head. You didn't walk away because of me, Enzo. You walked away because you were too scared to face your own weaknesses. Don't put that on me. Her words cut deep, and Enzo took a step back, guilt etched across his face. You're right, he admitted quietly. It wasn't about you. It was about me, and I've regretted it every day since. Helena crossed her arms, her guard still firmly in place. Regret doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't give you the right to show up here and ask for my help like nothing ever happened. Enzo nodded, his expression solemn. I'm not asking you to forget, Helena. I don't expect forgiveness. But this isn't just about me or my company. The blight is devastating the flowers, and if we can't stop it, it's going to destroy the livelihoods of countless people. Farmers, workers, families, they'll all suffer. Helena hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew what it was like to struggle, to fight for survival. The thought of innocent people losing everything because of a crisis they couldn't control tugged at her heart. I don't trust you, Enzo, she said finally, her voice firm. But if I help, it's for them, not for you. Relief flickered in his eyes, though he quickly masked it. That's all I can ask. Helena sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'll need to see the fields and the plants. I need to understand the extent of the damage before I can do anything. Enzo nodded. I can arrange for you to come to the site tomorrow. No, she said sharply. I'm not stepping into your world, Enzo. You want my help? You bring the samples here. I'll do it on my terms. He hesitated, but then nodded again. All right, I'll bring the samples tomorrow. As he turned to leave, Helena called after him, her voice tinged with defiance. And don't think this means I've forgiven you. I haven't. He paused, looking over his shoulder. I know, he said simply before walking away. That evening, Helena sat on the porch of her small home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her thoughts were a chaotic swirl of memories, emotions, and doubts. She had spent years building a life away from Enzo, away from the pain he had caused. Letting him back into her life, even in this limited capacity, felt like opening a door she had worked so hard to keep shut. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting people suffer because of her personal wounds, was something she couldn't bear. She had always believed in the power of nurturing life, of healing what was broken. If she could do that for her flowers, why not for this? The next day, Enzo arrived with Marco in tow, carrying carefully sealed containers of plants and soil samples. Helena gave them a quick nod and directed them to the garden shed, where she had set up a makeshift workspace. As she examined the samples, her focus shifted entirely to the task at hand. The blight was worse than she had anticipated, the roots of the plants rotting away, the soil infested with disease. It would take everything she knew and perhaps a bit of luck to find a solution. Enzo watched her from a distance, his gaze filled with a mixture of admiration and regret. This was the Helena he remembered, strong, determined, and unyielding in the face of a challenge. He wanted to say something, to bridge the chasm between them, but the weight of his mistakes held him back. Helena worked late into the evening, her mind racing with ideas. As the hours passed, she realized that the solution might not come quickly. It would require time, patience, and cooperation, things she wasn't sure she could give Enzo. But as she looked at the dying plants before her, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away, not when there was still a chance to save them. And so, as the night deepened, Helena made a silent vow. She would do what she could to stop the blight, to help the people who depended on these flowers. But she would not let herself fall into the trap of trusting Enzo again. Some wounds, she reminded herself, took more than time to heal. Helena was already in the garden shed when the sun broke over the horizon, her hands deep in soil as she examined the samples Enzo had brought. She'd been up most of the night, researching, sketching out ideas, and sifting through her memory for every natural technique she'd ever learned. The blight was aggressive, relentless in its destruction, but there was something familiar about it. She just couldn't place it yet. Her focus was broken by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Enzo standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. He looked out of place among the rustic tools and earthy scents of the shed, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark reminder of the world he came from. "I thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. Helena hesitated before taking it, her expression guarded. "Thanks," she said shortly, taking a small sip before setting it down. Enzo lingered by the door, his eyes scanning the organized chaos of her workspace. "Have you made any progress?" he asked cautiously. "I'm working on it," she replied without looking up, her voice clipped. He nodded, clearly uncomfortable with her coldness, but unwilling to press her. "If there's anything you need, just let me know." Helena didn't respond, and after a moment he left, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The hours stretched into the afternoon as Helena continued her work. She examined the infected plants under a magnifying glass, comparing them to healthy samples she had taken from her own garden. She took notes, cross-referenced them with books and articles, and started to piece together a picture of what she was dealing with. By the time she paused to stretch, her back aching from hours of hunching over the table, she realized she wasn't alone. Maria stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and a curious expression on her face. "You've been holed up in here all day," Maria said. "What's going on?" Helena sighed, setting down her tools. "It's complicated. Complicated enough for the fancy suit guy to come knocking on your door?" Maria teased, though there was genuine concern in her voice. Helena gave a bitter laugh. "That's Enzo, the man who left me at the altar." Maria's eyes widened. "Wait, that's him? The one who—" "Yep," Helena interrupted, not wanting to rehash the details. Maria frowned. "And now he's back, asking for your help." Helena nodded, her expression hard. "He's desperate. The flowers his company relies on are dying, and he doesn't know how to stop it. He thinks I might have the answer." "And are you going to help him?" "I don't know," Helena admitted. "Part of me wants to tell him to deal with it himself. But the other part, I keep thinking about the farmers, the workers who depend on those flowers. It's not their fault he's an idiot." Maria stepped closer, placing a hand on Helena's arm. "You're a better person than most. Just don't let him take advantage of you again, okay?" "I won't," Helena said firmly, though the words felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The next morning, Enzo arrived with Marco and a team of workers. They brought more samples, equipment, and detailed reports on the affected fields. Helena reluctantly allowed them to set up a temporary workstation in the garden, though she made it clear that they were guests in her space. As she reviewed the new data, Helena couldn't help but notice how the workers seemed to look to Enzo for guidance. Despite his polished exterior, he was attentive to their needs, making sure they were comfortable and well prepared. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, a leader who genuinely cared about his people. Still, she kept her guard up. Over the next few days, Helena and Enzo worked side by side, their interactions polite but distant. Enzo asked questions, listened to her explanations, and even tried to help with some of the hands-on tasks, though it was clear he was out of his element. At first, their conversations were purely professional, focused on the task at hand. But as the days turned into weeks, small cracks began to appear in Helena's walls. She caught herself softening toward him, especially when he talked about the farmers and the impact the blight was having on their lives. One evening, as they were wrapping up for the day, Enzo leaned against the workbench, his sleeves rolled up and his tie discarded. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" he asked quietly. Helena froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" "If I hadn't run that day," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "If I'd stayed, if we'd gotten married, do you think we could have made it work?" She looked at him, her emotions a tangle of anger and sadness. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But you didn't stay, so we'll never know." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I wish I could go back and fix it." "You can't," she said firmly. "All you can do now is deal with the mess you made." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. The next day, Helena finally had a breakthrough. After hours of testing, she identified a combination of natural treatments that could potentially halt the spread of the blight. It involved using specific plants to create a protective barrier and introducing beneficial insects to control the pests that were weakening the flowers. She called Enzo and Marco into the shed, laying out her findings. "This is what I've come up with," she said, pointing to her notes. "It's not a guaranteed fix, but it's the best chance we've got." Enzo studied the notes, his brow furrowed. "How long will it take to implement?" "A few weeks," Helena said. "And it'll require a lot of coordination. The farmers will need to be involved directly." Marco frowned. "That's going to be a tough sell. Some of them are already losing hope." "Then we give them a reason to hope," Helena said firmly. "If we can show them that this works, even on a small scale, they'll be willing to try." Enzo nodded. "We'll make it happen." Over the following days, Helena worked closely with the farmers, teaching them the techniques she had developed. She spent hours in the fields, her hands dirty and her back aching, but she didn't complain. Enzo was often by her side, surprising her with his willingness to get his hands dirty and his genuine concern for the people around him. Despite her lingering resentment, Helena couldn't ignore the changes she saw in him. He was no longer the man who had run from his responsibilities. He was really trying, to make things right. But for Helena, the question remained, was it enough? As the first signs of recovery appeared in the fields, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. The farmers smiled again, their voices filled with cautious optimism. For the first time in weeks, Helena allowed herself to believe that they might actually save the flowers. And yet, as she stood in the middle of the fields one evening, watching the sun set over the rows of blooming plants, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were still ahead. For the flowers, for the people, and for her own heart. The soft hum of crickets filled the night air as Helena sat on the edge of her porch, her gaze fixed on the distant outline of the fields. The first signs of recovery were visible, small pockets of green where the blight had started to recede. It was progress, but her heart remained heavy. No matter how much time she spent in the fields, no matter how many hours she poured into the fight against the blight, the past seemed to linger like a shadow over every step she took. It had been weeks since Enzo arrived, and though their collaboration was yielding results, Helena's emotions remained tangled. Each day brought moments that made her question the walls she had built around herself. The way he knelt beside her in the fields, genuinely asking questions and listening to her answers. The way he interacted with the farmers, ensuring they had the tools and support they needed. There was something undeniably different about him now, something she hadn't seen in the man she had once loved. She let out a sigh, resting her chin on her hand. She didn't want to soften toward him, didn't want to feel anything for the man who had shattered her heart. But as much as she tried to resist, cracks were beginning to form in her resolve. The next morning, Helena woke before dawn, as she always did. The cool air was tinged with the earthy scent of soil and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. She walked to the garden shed, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path, and began preparing her tools for another day in the fields. Enzo arrived shortly after, his presence announced by the rumble of his car. Helena glanced up as he stepped out, dressed casually in rolled-up sleeves and work boots, a far cry from the polished suits he had worn when he first appeared. He carried a thermos in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. "Good morning," he said, his voice tentative but warm. Helena nodded, keeping her focus on her tools. "Morning. I brought breakfast," he added, holding up the bag. "I thought you might need a break." She hesitated, her instinct to brush him off battling against her hunger. Finally, she wiped her hands on a cloth and took the bag. Inside were 2 fresh pastries, still warm. She looked at him, her brow furrowed. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. "I wanted to," he replied, his gaze steady. "It's the least I can do." They ate in silence, sitting on the edge of the shed. Helena focused on the pastry in her hands, the buttery layers melting in her mouth. She hated how much she appreciated the gesture, how it chipped away at the carefully constructed distance she had tried to maintain. "Helena," Enzo said after a while, his tone serious. "I know I've said it before, but I need you to know how sorry I am for what I did. Not just for leaving, but for the way I handled everything. You deserve better." She didn't look at him, her fingers tightening around the paper bag. "I don't need your apologies, Enzo," she said, her voice hard. "They don't change anything." "I know," he said softly, "but I mean them." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then Helena stood abruptly, brushing crumbs from her hands. "We should get to work," she said, walking toward the fields. Enzo followed her without another word. The day was long and grueling, the sun beating down mercilessly as Helena and Enzo worked side by side. They inspected rows of flowers, applying the natural treatment she had devised and monitoring their progress. Enzo asked questions about the process, his curiosity genuine. Helena answered tersely at first, but as the hours passed, she found herself opening up, her passion for the work overriding her guardedness. By mid-afternoon, they took a break under the shade of a large oak tree. Enzo leaned back against the trunk, his shirt damp with sweat, while Helena sipped water from a canteen. "You really know what you're doing," Enzo said, his tone filled with admiration. "The way you've handled this, honestly, it's incredible." Helena shrugged, though her cheeks flushed faintly. "It's just what I've always done. Flowers are my life." "And you've built something amazing here," he said, gesturing toward the distant rows of flowers in her garden. "It's beautiful." She looked at him, her expression softening despite herself. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "After what happened, I didn't think I'd ever find a way forward. But I had to, for them." "Them?" Enzo asked, his brow furrowing. Helena hesitated, realizing what she had just revealed. She had been so careful to keep her children out of the conversation, to shield them from this complicated chapter of her life. But the words were already out. "My children," she said quietly. "Alice, Luca, and Clara." Enzo's eyes widened in shock, and he sat up straighter. "Children? You have children?" "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "3 of them. They're mine, and they're yours." The silence that followed was deafening. Enzo stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and something else she couldn't quite place. Joy, fear, regret? She couldn't tell. How old are they?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 4, Helena said. "They're 4 years old." Enzo ran a hand through his hair, his breath unsteady. "Helena, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I know you didn't, she said, her tone sharp, because you didn't bother to stick around long enough to find out. His face crumpled, the weight of her words hitting him like a blow. I thought about you every day, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to reach out, but I was too ashamed. I didn't think I had the right. You didn't, Helena said coldly. And you still don't. They're my children. I raised them. I was the one who stayed when everything fell apart. I'm not trying to take that away from you, Enzo said, his voice breaking. But please, let me be a part of their lives. Let me make up for what I've done. Helena shook her head, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. You don't get to decide that now, Enzo. You left, and I had to pick up the pieces alone. They don't even know you exist. His expression crumbled further, and for the first time, Helena saw real pain in his eyes. Not the guilt or regret he had shown before, but the raw, unfiltered anguish of a man who had just realized what he had lost. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. Helena stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Sorry doesn't fix anything, she said, turning away. Let's get back to work. The rest of the day passed in strained silence. Helena threw herself into her tasks with renewed vigor, her movements sharp and precise. Enzo followed her lead, his usual questions and comments replaced by a somber quiet. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, they had made significant progress in treating the affected plants. But as Helena packed up her tools, she felt no sense of accomplishment, only an overwhelming exhaustion, both physical and emotional. Enzo lingered as she closed the garden shed, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. I meant what I said, he murmured. I want to make things right. For them. For you. Helena's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but she forced herself to remain steadfast. You can't fix this with words, Enzo, she said quietly. It's going to take more than that. And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing alone in the fading light. Helena's hands worked methodically as she arranged flowers into neat bundles, the scent of lavender and marigold filling the air around her. It was early morning, and the town's small farmers' market buzzed with life as vendors set up their stalls. She had brought her children along this time, a rare occurrence. Alice, Luca, and Clara giggled as they played near the stand, their innocent laughter a balm to her frayed nerves. The market was one of the few places where Helena could relax, surrounded by the simple rhythms of the community. But today, her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the events of the past week. Enzo's unexpected discovery of the children had upended the delicate balance she'd fought so hard to create. She glanced toward the market entrance and caught her breath. There he was. Enzo stood near the entrance, his tall frame unmistakable even in the sea of people. He wasn't in one of his tailored suits today. Instead, he wore a simple shirt and jeans, his sleeves rolled up and his expression uncertain. In his hands, he carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. Helena stiffened, her heart pounding. She hadn't invited him here, hadn't wanted him to intrude on this part of her life. But before she could act, Luca spotted him. Mommy, look, it's the man from the garden. Luca's voice rang out, drawing the attention of his sisters. Alice and Clara turned, their curious gazes locking on Enzo as he slowly approached. Helena felt her stomach twist. This was not how she wanted them to meet him. Not here, not now. Helena, Enzo said softly when he reached her, his eyes flickering from her to the children. I didn't mean to intrude. I wanted to see you. And Her jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Luca stepped forward. Hi, did you come to buy flowers? He asked, his wide eyes fixed on the bouquet in Enzo's hands. Enzo knelt to Luca's height, a small smile playing on his lips. I brought these for your mom, he said, holding out the bouquet. For Mommy, Alice echoed, tilting her head. Why? Helena felt her cheeks flush as she quickly stepped in. Kids, Why don't you go play over by Maria's stand? I'll call you when it's time to leave." The children hesitated, their curiosity obvious, but they obeyed, running off toward Maria's brightly decorated stall. Helena turned to Enzo, her expression icy. "You can't just show up like this," she said sharply. "This is my life, my space." "I know," he said, his voice calm but earnest. "I just wanted to see them, to see you." Her frustration bubbled to the surface. "Do you realize how confusing this is for them? They don't know who you are, Enzo. They don't need this upheaval in their lives." "They deserve to know," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "I deserve to know them. Helena, I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be part of their future. Please." Helena crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "They're not your responsibility, Enzo. You don't get to just walk in and decide you want to be a father now." "I know I don't have the right," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But I'm here. I'm trying. Please, give me a chance to prove that I can be someone they can count on." Her chest tightened at the raw sincerity in his eyes. For a moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with years ago, the man she had believed would stand by her side through anything. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Enzo nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Later that evening, Helena sat on the porch of her small house, watching the children play in the yard. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the scene, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Alice ran up to her, her face lit with excitement. "Mommy, the man from the market, he's nice. Why don't we see him more?" Helena hesitated, unsure how to explain. "He's someone from a long time ago," she said carefully. "Someone Mommy used to know." "Did you like him?" Alice asked innocently, tilting her head. Helena smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from Alice's face. "I did, a long time ago." "Is he going to come back?" Clara chimed in, joining her sister. Helena looked at her children, their bright eyes filled with curiosity and innocence. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But no matter what happens, you'll always have me." "Okay." The girls nodded, satisfied with her answer, and ran off to join Luca. Over the next few weeks, Enzo made a concerted effort to be part of their lives. He didn't push or demand. Instead, he found small ways to be present. He visited the fields during the day, helping with the treatments and spending time with the farmers. In the evenings, he lingered near the garden, where the children often played after dinner. At first, Helena resented his presence, worried that he was disrupting the fragile stability she had worked so hard to create. But as the days passed, she began to notice the small moments that made her reconsider. The way Luca's face lit up when Enzo showed him how to skip stones across the nearby creek. The way Clara clung to Enzo's hand when she tripped and scraped her knee. The way Alice asked him endless questions about his life in the city, her curiosity insatiable. One evening, as Helena stood in the kitchen washing dishes, she glanced out the window and saw Enzo sitting on the porch with the children. He was reading them a story, his voice animated as he brought the characters to life. The children giggled and leaned closer to him, their faces filled with delight. Helena's heart ached at the sight. She wanted to hate him, to hold on to the anger and betrayal that had fueled her for so long. But seeing him with the children, seeing how naturally they connected with him, made it impossible to ignore the truth. They needed him. And maybe, just maybe, she did too. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Enzo lingered in the garden, his gaze fixed on the rows of flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Helena joined him, her arms crossed as she stood beside him. "They like you," she said quietly. Enzo looked at her, his expression soft. "They're incredible. You've done an amazing job with them, Helena." She nodded, her throat tight. "It wasn't easy, but they're my everything." "I can see that," he said. "And I want to be part of their lives, if you let me." not to take anything away from you, but to add to what they already have. Helena looked at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was a man who was trying, a man who had changed. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said finally. "I don't expect you to," he replied. "But for their sake," she continued, her voice steady, "I'm willing to try." Enzo's eyes lit with gratitude and he nodded. "That's all I could ask for." As the stars began to fill the night sky, Helena felt a small sliver of hope take root in her heart. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a fresh start, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. The field stretched out before Helena, bathed in the pale morning light. The air was thick with a mixture of hope and tension, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone who stood there. The natural treatments she had devised were showing signs of success, but the progress was slow, too slow. The blight wasn't giving up without a fight, and the farmers were growing restless. Helena glanced at the farmers gathered around her. Their faces were etched with worry, their livelihoods hanging by a thread. She had gotten to know many of them over the past few weeks. Carlos, whose family had tended the land for 3 generations. Sophia, a young mother who relied on the fields to support her 2 daughters, and Mr. Alvarez, the oldest and most respected farmer in the region, whose stoic exterior was beginning to crack under the pressure. Standing among them was Enzo, his sleeves rolled up and his expression serious. He had earned the farmers' reluctant respect through his willingness to work alongside them, but his presence still sparked unease. Many saw him as the face of the company that had profited from their labor for years, and now, in the wake of the blight, his desperation to save his business was palpable. Helena stepped forward, holding a clipboard filled with notes. "We're making progress," she began, her voice firm despite the murmurs of doubt rippling through the group. "The treatments are working, but we need to move faster. If we don't act now, the blight could still destroy the entire harvest." Carlos shook his head, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've been patient, Helena, but we're running out of time. We've already lost so much." "I understand," Helena said, meeting his gaze. "But this is our best chance. If we can double our efforts, we can stop the blight before it spreads any further." Sophia spoke up, her voice trembling. "What if it's too late? What if we're already past the point of saving anything?" Helena hesitated, the weight of their fear pressing heavily on her. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Enzo beside her. "It's not too late," Enzo said, his voice steady. "I know you're scared. I am too. But Helena's plan is working. I've seen it with my own eyes. If we give up now, everything we've done so far will be for nothing." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the group was silent. Mr. Alvarez finally stepped forward, his weathered face lined with determination. "I've been farming these fields for 50 years, he said, "and I've seen bad years and worse years. But I've also seen what happens when people don't give up. I trust Helena. If she says this can work, then we owe it to ourselves to see it through." A ripple of agreement passed through the group, hesitant but growing stronger. Helena felt a surge of gratitude for Mr. Alvarez's support, and she nodded. "Let's get to work," she said. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Teams of workers spread across the fields, applying the natural treatments Helena had designed. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their movements a blur of determination. Enzo was always in the thick of it, hauling supplies, coordinating efforts, and encouraging the farmers to stay the course. Helena threw herself into the work, her focus unwavering. She moved from one section of the fields to another, inspecting the plants, offering guidance, and adjusting the treatments as needed. Her hands were raw from hours of labor, her back aching, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The stakes were too high. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Helena stood in the middle of the fields, surveying the progress. The sight of the healthy plants beginning to flourish amidst the blighted ones filled her with cautious hope. But the fight wasn't over yet. Enzo approached her, his shirt damp with sweat and his hair disheveled. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he said, his concern evident. Helena shook her head. There's too much to do. I can rest when this is over. You won't be any use to anyone if you collapse, he said, his tone gentle but firm. At least take a moment to eat something. She sighed, realizing he was right. Fine, she said, sitting on a nearby crate. Enzo handed her a bottle of water and a sandwich, and she accepted them with a nod of thanks. They ate in silence for a while, the sounds of the night filling the air around them. Finally, Enzo spoke. You've done something incredible here, Helena. The way you've brought everyone together, the way you've fought for this, it's inspiring. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. I didn't do this for you, Enzo. I did it for them. I know, he said softly, but that doesn't make it any less extraordinary. Helena didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the horizon. A part of her wanted to believe him, to let his words chip away at the walls she had built around her heart. But another part of her, the part that still carried the scars of his betrayal, resisted. The next morning brought a setback. A patch of the fields that had been treated showed signs of the blight returning, its tendrils spreading faster than before. Panic rippled through the workers as word spread, and Helena felt her heart sink. She knelt beside the infected plants, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Enzo crouched beside her, his brow furrowed. What do you think happened? He asked. Helena examined the soil, her fingers sifting through the dirt. It's the soil, she said finally. It's weaker here, which makes it harder for the treatments to take hold. We need to reinforce it. How? He asked. Helena stood, her determination renewed. Compost, mulch, anything we can use to strengthen the soil and create a barrier. It'll take time, but it can work. Enzo nodded. I'll get the team on it right away. As the workers mobilized, Helena felt a flicker of doubt creep in. What if this wasn't enough? What if they were fighting a losing battle? She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. The days blurred together as the fight against the blight intensified. Helena worked tirelessly, her determination bolstered by the small victories they began to see. The healthy plants were thriving, their vibrant blooms standing in defiance of the disease that threatened to consume them. Enzo was a constant presence, his unwavering support surprising her more than once. He wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for the farmers, for the community, and for something bigger than himself. One evening, as they stood together in the fields, Helena allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. Do you ever wonder if we're going to win this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Enzo looked at her, his gaze steady. I don't know, he admitted. But what I do know is that we're doing everything we can, and that's all anyone can ask for. Helena nodded, his words resonating with her. She took a deep breath, the weight on her chest easing slightly. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could save the fields. And as the stars began to fill the night sky, she realized something else. They weren't just saving the flowers. They were saving each other. The first rays of dawn illuminated the fields, casting a golden glow over the rows of flowers that had begun to fight their way back to life. For the first time in months, Helena allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. The natural treatments were working. The infected plants were stabilizing, and vibrant new growth was emerging where the blight had once taken hold. She stood at the edge of the fields, her arms crossed as she took it all in. The farmers, who had once been skeptical, now moved through the rows with renewed energy, carefully applying the treatments she had devised. Their murmured conversations carried an undertone of cautious optimism, a welcome contrast to the despair that had hung over them just weeks before. Enzo approached her, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hands were dirty from working alongside the farmers, a sight Helena never thought she'd see. It's beautiful, isn't it? He said, stopping beside her. It's a start, she replied, her tone measured. Enzo nodded, understanding the guardedness in her voice. None of this would have been possible without you, Helena. You gave them hope when I couldn't. Helena didn't respond right away. Her gaze remained fixed on the fields, her thoughts a tangle of emotions. "It's not just about the flowers," she said finally. "It's about everything they represent: livelihoods, families, futures. Losing these fields would have meant losing so much more than plants." "And you saved it," Enzo said softly. She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "Don't make this about me, Enzo. You're the one who put them in this position in the first place." His expression tightened, but he didn't argue. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I made mistakes, big ones. I didn't realize the consequences of my actions until it was almost too late. But I'm trying to fix that now." Helena let out a long breath, her anger softening slightly. "Trying isn't always enough," she said quietly. Later that day, Helena walked through the fields with Mr. Alvarez, who had become one of her strongest allies among the farmers. His weathered hands traced the leaves of a healthy plant, a small smile playing on his lips. "You've done something remarkable here, Helena," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "These fields wouldn't be standing if it weren't for you." Helena shook her head. "It wasn't just me. Everyone here played a part." "That's true," Mr. Alvarez agreed. "But you were the one who brought us together. That's no small thing." She felt a pang of gratitude for his words, but they also stirred a deeper unease. While she had fought for the farmers and their fields, the emotions tied to Enzo's presence remained unresolved. "Mr. Alvarez," she said hesitantly, "do you think people can change? Truly change?" He looked at her thoughtfully, his eyes filled with the wisdom of a lifetime spent weathering storms. "People can change," he said, "but it's not about what they say, it's about what they do. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But if someone is willing to put in the work, to prove themselves, then yes, I believe they can change." Helena nodded, his words settling into her heart like seeds waiting to grow. That evening, Helena found herself standing on the porch of her small home, watching as Enzo played with the children in the yard. Alice and Clara chased each other, their laughter ringing through the air, while Luca sat beside Enzo, eagerly showing him a small wooden toy he had carved. It was a scene Helena never thought she'd see, a man she had once loved, now connecting so effortlessly with the children she had raised alone. Her heart ached with the weight of it, a mixture of longing and resentment swirling within her. "Mommy, come play with us," Alice called, waving her over. Helena smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Maybe later, sweetheart." Enzo glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. "You're raising some incredible kids, Helena," he said. "They're incredible because of them," she replied, her voice steady. "Not because of me." He shook his head. "Don't sell yourself short. You've given them everything they needed to grow into the amazing little people they are." Helena looked away, his words cutting through the walls she had worked so hard to maintain. As the days passed, the fields continued to recover, and so did the community. The farmers smiled more freely, their laughter echoing across the rows of flowers. Enzo became a familiar presence among them, his initial status as an outsider slowly fading. He listened to their concerns, worked alongside them, and even organized a small gathering to celebrate the progress they had made. Helena watched from a distance, her feelings toward him shifting in ways she couldn't quite name. She saw a man who was trying, not for himself, but for others. He was still the same Enzo she had fallen in love with years ago, but now he carried a depth and humility she hadn't seen before. One evening, as they worked together in the fields, Enzo broke the silence between them. "Helena," he said, his voice tentative, "I know I've said it before, but I need you to know how much I regret what I did to you. Leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life." She paused, her hands stilling as she turned to face him. "You hurt me, Enzo, more than I thought anyone ever could. You left me to pick up the pieces of a life we were supposed to build together." "I know," he said, his eyes filled with pain. "And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm not that man anymore. I've changed because of you, because of what you've shown me, what you've taught me." Helena studied him, her heart torn. She wanted to believe him, to let go of the anger and bitterness she had carried for so long. But trust wasn't something she could give so easily. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted, her voice trembling. "That's okay," he said softly. "I'll keep proving myself to you for as long as it takes." The final test of their efforts came in the form of an inspection by agricultural officials. If the fields passed, they would be declared free of the blight, and the flowers could be harvested without risk. It was a nerve-wracking day for everyone, the hours stretching endlessly as the officials moved through the fields, taking samples and making notes. When the results were announced, the collective sigh of relief was almost palpable. The fields had been saved. Cheers erupted among the farmers, their joy spilling over as they hugged each other and celebrated. Helena felt a surge of pride as she looked around, knowing that they had all fought for this moment together. Enzo found her amid the crowd, his eyes shining with gratitude. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it," Helena corrected, her lips curving into a small smile. "You earned their trust. That's no small thing." He shook his head. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." For the first time, Helena didn't argue. Instead, she let his words settle, a quiet warmth blooming in her chest. That night, as the town celebrated, Helena stood on the edge of the garden, watching the stars. Enzo joined her, his presence familiar and comforting. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she asked, turning to look at him. "For giving me a second chance," he said. "For showing me what really matters." Helena nodded, her heart finally beginning to lighten. "It's not forgiveness," she said softly. "Not yet, but it's a start." And as they stood together under the night sky, Helena allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could bloom again, this time stronger than before. The morning sun rose gently over the fields, casting long shadows across the rows of flowers that now swayed in vibrant hues of purple, yellow, and red. The sweet scent of the blooms filled the air, a stark contrast to the despair that had hung over this place just weeks before. Helena stood at the edge of the fields, her hands resting lightly on her hips, a quiet smile playing on her lips. The land had survived. The people had survived. Behind her, the voices of children rang out, bright and carefree. Alice, Luca, and Clara raced through the garden, their laughter echoing across the space. Enzo was crouched among the flowers, helping Clara balance as she picked a small handful of blossoms. He smiled as she handed him a daisy, her proud expression making him chuckle. Helena watched them from a distance, her heart pulling in two directions. Seeing her children with Enzo stirred emotions she hadn't let herself feel in years. Hope, longing, and a cautious joy. But it also reminded her of the pain she had carried, the night she had spent alone, wondering why she wasn't enough for him to stay. As if sensing her gaze, Enzo looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He gave her a small smile, one that spoke of gratitude and something deeper. Helena turned away, busying herself with a row of marigolds. Later that day, the farmers gathered to celebrate the field's recovery. Tables were set up under the shade of tall oaks, laden with homemade dishes and fresh produce. Music played from a small speaker, and the hum of conversation and laughter filled the air. It wasn't just a celebration of the flowers. It was a celebration of resilience, of coming together as a community to overcome the odds. Helena mingled with the farmers, exchanging hugs and congratulations. Mr. Alvarez approached her, a rare smile softening his weathered face. "You did it," he said, clasping her hand. "We all did it, but none of this would have been possible without you." Helena shook her head. "It was a team effort. I just pointed us in the right direction." Mr. Alvarez chuckled. "You're too modest, Helena. Take the credit. You've earned it." She glanced around at the smiling faces, the fields bursting with life, and felt a swell of pride. But it wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had fought alongside her, including Enzo. Speaking of him, Helena noticed him standing near the edge of the gathering, a glass of lemonade in his hand as he spoke with Carlos. He had spent the past weeks earning the farmer's trust, and it showed in the way Carlos laughed at something Enzo said, clapping him on the shoulder. For all her lingering doubts, Helena couldn't deny that he had changed. He wasn't the man who had left her at the altar. He had worked tirelessly, not just to save his company, but to make things right for the people who depended on it. As the celebration wound down and the crowd began to thin, Enzo approached Helena. The sun was setting, painting the fields in shades of gold and orange. He held out a glass of lemonade, and she accepted it with a small nod. "You look tired," he said, his voice gentle. "It's been a long few weeks," she admitted. "And an even longer few years," he added, his tone laced with regret. Helena glanced at him, her defenses still instinctively raised. "What do you want, Enzo?" "I just wanted to talk," he said. "No pressure, no expectations. Just talk." She hesitated but eventually nodded, leading him toward the garden where the children were playing. They sat on the edge of a stone bench, the sounds of Alice and Clara giggling in the background as Luca tried to build a tiny fort with sticks and leaves. Enzo took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that I don't get to just walk back into your life and act like nothing happened. And you're right. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Helena, but I want to earn it, even if it takes the rest of my life." Helena looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "You hurt me, Enzo, more than I thought I could ever be hurt. And for years, I've carried that pain, convincing myself I didn't need you, that I could do this on my own." "And you did," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You built a life for yourself and the kids, a beautiful one. They're happy, Helena, and that's because of you." She swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't know if I can ever forget what you did, but I see how hard you've been trying, and maybe I can learn to forgive you." Enzo's breath hitched and he turned to her, his eyes bright with hope. "That's all I could ask for. I don't want to undo the past. I just want to build a better future. For them. For us." Helena's gaze flicked to the children, who were now chasing each other through the garden. She thought about the life she had built, the strength it had taken to get here. Letting Enzo back in felt like a risk, but as she watched him with their children, she saw the man he had become, the man who was willing to fight for them, just as she had. The following days brought a sense of quiet stability. Enzo continued to be present, not just for the children, but for the community. He helped organize a plan to ensure the fields would remain healthy, working closely with the farmers to implement long-term solutions. Helena found herself softening toward him in ways she hadn't expected. They still had their moments of tension, but there were also moments of connection. Shared laughter over a joke one of the kids told. Quiet conversations about the future as they worked side by side in the garden. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Helena and Enzo sat on the porch, the air cool and still. He turned to her, his expression serious but tender. "Helena," he said softly, "I don't want to rush you, and I don't want to overstep, but I need to know, do you think there's a chance for us? For all of us?" She met his gaze, her heart pounding. For a long moment, she didn't speak, the weight of the question hanging between them. Finally, she let out a breath. "There's a chance," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's not going to be easy, Enzo. Trust takes time, and so does healing." He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm willing to wait, for as long as it takes." Helena smiled faintly, the corners of her lips lifting in a way they hadn't in years. "Then we'll take it one step at a time." As the weeks turned into months, the fields flourished, and so did the bonds between Helena, Enzo, and their children. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was messy, filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But it was real, and it was theirs. On a crisp autumn morning, Helena stood in the garden with Enzo by her side, their children running ahead of them. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors vibrant against the blue sky. For the first time in a long time, Helena felt at peace. The thorns of the past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they had become part of the foundation on which she was building something new, something strong and beautiful. And as she reached for Enzo's hand, she knew they were ready to face whatever came next together. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care